let me tell you about a morning I'll never forget. I've told this story a few times now, to friends, to family, once to a stranger on a train who I never saw again, and every single time when I get to the end, the person listening goes quiet, really quiet, the kind of quiet where you can tell something inside them just shifted. So I'll tell it to you, from the start, the way it really happened. It was early November. London, the kind of cold that doesn't bite, it just sinks, gets into your bones and settles there like it's planning to stay. The sky over the city that morning was the color of wet stone, low and heavy, and there was this thin drizzle coming down. Not real rain, not enough to open an umbrella, just enough to make everything look like it was crying a little. The pavement was dark with it. The bare trees dripped. Even the pigeons looked miserable. I wasn't supposed to be there, honestly. I'd taken the morning off work for something else entirely, and I'd cut through the park because it was quicker, and I ended up near the Old Guards Memorial, that quiet corner where the soldiers are remembered. You know the place, where the tourists gather in summer, where the old ones come, the ones with the medals and the faraway looks, to stand and remember the people the rest of us never met. There were maybe 100 people there that morning, maybe more. Some had cameras. Some had paper poppies pinned to their coats even though the big day had passed. A few children, bored, tugging at their parents, not really understanding why everyone had gone so hushed. A man selling roasted chestnuts from a little cart, the smoke curling up gray against the gray sky. The smell of it. I still remember the smell of it. And then there was her. I want you to really see her because everyone else that morning didn't. That's the whole point. Nobody saw her. An old woman. Small, and I mean genuinely small. She couldn't have been more than 5'2", and the years had folded her down even shorter than that. She wore this long gray coat that had clearly lived a long life. The kind of coat your grandmother might have worn. The wool had gone thin at the elbows. The buttons didn't quite match anymore. You could tell one had been replaced with whatever was in the sewing tin. Her shoes were sensible and old and polished. Somebody who had nothing still polished her shoes. That detail stayed with me. Her hair was white, pinned back neat under a little dark hat. And her hands were shaking. Not violently. Just that constant fine tremor that comes with age or with cold or with something heavier than either. She was holding a single bunch of flowers, white roses, 5 of them, maybe 6, wrapped in plain brown paper, the cheap kind, the kind you get from a bucket outside a corner shop, not from a proper florist with ribbon and tissue. You could see where the damp had started to soften the paper at the bottom. And nobody was paying her the slightest bit of attention. That's the thing about old women in gray coats. They become invisible. The world just sort of slides past them. People walked right by her like she was a lamppost, a bin, part of the pavement. Their eyes went over her and through her and never once landed. But I noticed her. I genuinely don't know why. Maybe because she was the only person there not holding up a phone. Maybe because she wasn't talking to anyone, wasn't with anyone, wasn't doing anything except standing very still and looking at that memorial like it was the only thing in the entire city that was real. She looked at it the way you'd look at an old friend you hadn't seen in years, or the way you'd look at a grave. After a while she started to move, slowly, so slowly. She shuffled forward, one careful step at a time, toward the front of the memorial where the proper wreaths had been laid, the big formal ones with their crisp ribbons and their printed cards. She just wanted to put her little brown paper roses down with the rest, to add her small thing to the big things, to say, I was here too, I remember too. And that's when it happened. A man stepped into her path. Now I'd already clocked this man earlier because you couldn't really not. He'd been there about 10 minutes and the whole time he'd been making the place his. Tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing one of those long wool coats that costs more than I make in a month, the kind that hangs just right, the kind that announces money before the man does. Polished shoes, a watch that caught the light even on a gray day. And the phone. The phone had been glued to his ear the entire time. He'd been packing back and forth across the path, gesturing with his free hand, talking loud enough that bits of it floated over to the rest of us. Something about a deal, a meeting, a number that was apparently not good enough. He kept saying, "No, no, that's not what we agreed," in this clipped, impatient voice. He had the air of a man who genuinely believed the entire morning had been arranged for his convenience and was running late. He was packing right across the spot the old woman needed to cross, and he wasn't looking. He was looking at the middle distance, the way people do when they're arguing on the phone, seeing nothing in front of them at all. The old woman, with her shaking hands and her cheap white roses, didn't see his arm move. He turned, sharp, frustrated, flinging his free hand out to make some point to whoever was on the line, and the back of his hand caught her full across the face. It wasn't a tap. It was the sound I remember most. That's the thing. Of everything that happened that morning, the thing my body still flinches at is the sound. A flat, ugly crack that cut clean through the hush of that quiet square. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in a peaceful place. The kind of sound that makes 100 heads turn at once. And she went down. The flowers left her hand and scattered across the wet stone. White roses on gray paving in the gray rain. And this tiny old woman just folded. That's the only word for it. She didn't fall dramatically. She folded quietly, the way a coat slips off a hook down onto the cold pavement. And for a second, nobody moved. You know that horrible frozen second, when something terrible happens right in front of you and the whole world just stops, and every single brain in the crowd is going, "Wait, did that? No, did he just?" That second, it stretched. It felt like a year. And then the man looked down at her. And here's the part that turned my stomach. Here's the part I still can't fully explain. He didn't help her. He looked annoyed. He pulled the phone an inch from his ear, glanced down at this old woman crumpled on the wet ground, and he said, loud enough for half of us to hear clearly, "Oh, for God's sake, watch where you're going. Watch where you're going," to the woman he had just knocked to the ground. And then he put the phone back to his ear and said, "Sorry, no, nothing, just some woman walked into me. Go on. Just some woman. I need you to understand the kind of silence that fell over that place, because it wasn't an empty silence. It was a full one, a loud one. The kind where 100 people are all thinking the exact same thing at the exact same moment, and not one of them knows what on earth to do about it." The old woman was on the ground. She'd got herself up onto one elbow slowly, shakily. Her little hat had come off and rolled a few feet away. Her white hair had come loose on one side, and her cheek was already going red, a deep angry red that you knew would be a bruise by evening. There was a thin line of blood at the corner of her lip, just a small one. But against all that gray, the gray coat, the gray sky, the gray stone, that little line of red looked so bright it hurt to look at. Like one of her own roses had bled onto her face. And the man, let's just call him what the entire crowd was already calling him in their heads, this man straightened his coat. He actually adjusted his cuff. He brushed at his sleeve as if she'd somehow soiled it by existing too close to him, as though the whole thing had been an inconvenience to his dry cleaning. A young woman near me with a pram put her hand over her mouth and said, "Oh my God, somebody help her." But here's the cruel little truth about crowds. Everybody waits for somebody else to go first. We were all decent people. I'd bet money on it. 100 decent people. And in those first frozen seconds, not one of us moved. We were all waiting for permission, for someone braver to break the spell. It was a boy who broke it. A teenager, 16, maybe 17, in a school uniform with his tie shoved in his pocket and his bag slung over one shoulder. He'd been standing near the front, and he just went, dropped down onto his knees on the wet stone beside her, not caring about his school trousers, and put a hand gently on her shoulder. "Are you all right?" he said. "Miss, are you okay? Can you hear me?" And the man in the expensive coat, and I promise you this is true, he scoffed. He actually scoffed, this little puff of contempt through his nose, and he looked at the boy crouched in the rain and said, She walked into me. Honestly, people need to learn to keep out of the way. That's when the crowd started to turn. You could feel it, like the temperature dropping. The murmurs started. Did you see that? He hit her. He hit an old woman. He's not even helping her. A big man in a high-vis jacket, a builder by the look of him, took a step forward and said, low and hard, "Mate, you don't put your hands on an old lady." And that's when she spoke, the woman on the ground. Her voice was quiet, but it was steady, far steadier than her hands. She wasn't looking at the man who hit her. She was looking past him, past all of us, toward the memorial, at the names carved in the stone. She said, "I only wanted to put my flowers down." That broke something open in the crowd. I heard the young woman with the pram make a small sound. I felt my own throat go tight. There was something about the simplicity of it. Not "why did you hit me?" Not "how dare you?" Not "do you know how old I am?" Just "I only wanted to put my flowers down." The smallness of what she'd wanted. The smallness of her. But the man didn't soften. Men like that never soften. When the crowd turns, they puff up. He turned to face us, all of us, and he spread his arms wide, and he raised his voice, and he said, "And who's going to do anything about it? Any of you. Go on. Do you have any idea who I am? Do you have any idea who I am?" 6 words. The favorite words of every man on earth who has never once in his life had to actually find out what happens when nobody cares who he is. And then God, this part, he smiled. He actually smiled, pleased with himself, and he bent down. And for 1 second I thought, finally, he's going to help her up. He's seen sense. He didn't. He bent down and picked up one of her white roses from the wet ground. He held it up. He looked at it, turning it in his fingers like a man inspecting something distasteful. And then he let it drop, right in front of her face. "Cheap flowers," he said, "figures." And he turned to walk away. Now, I have replayed the next 10 seconds in my mind more times than I can count, because it's the hinge. It's the moment the whole morning turned on, and I very nearly missed it because, like everyone else, I was watching the man walk off. But the boy in the school uniform, still kneeling beside her, he wasn't watching the man. He was looking the other way, across the open parade ground toward the soldiers' side, and I watched his face change. I watched his mouth open. I watched his eyes go wide. And he said, very quietly, almost to himself, "Hello." Just that, "oh." I turned to follow where he was looking. 3 men were crossing the parade ground, walking toward us, in step, and something about the way they moved made the hair on my arm stand up before my brain had even worked out why. And the whole square, the whole gray, cold, ordinary morning, was about to find out exactly who that old woman in the worn gray coat really was. You have to picture it properly. Take your time with it the way I do. 3 men crossing the open ground in perfect step. Full dress uniform, the dark, formal kind, almost black against the gray morning, with the red sashes cutting across and rows of medals on every chest, dull and heavy, catching what little light there was and giving it back. Their caps were low. Their backs were straight as iron rods, and they moved together, the 3 of them, like they'd been moving together their whole lives, like one creature with 3 bodies. And here's how I knew, before anyone said a word, that these were not ordinary soldiers. It was the way the men on duty reacted. You know, the guardsmen, the young ones at their posts who never move, never blink, never react to anything, not the tourists pulling faces, not the children, not the cameras an inch from their noses. They are trained to be stone. And I watched the nearest one, a young lad, can't have been 20, I watched him see these 3 men coming, and I watched something go through him like an electric current. His spine snapped straighter than I thought a spine could go. His chin came up. His whole body said someone important is here. Because these weren't just officers. These were generals. 3 of them, old men, but the kind of old that doesn't sag. The kind of old where the body has slowed right down but the eyes have not slowed at all. The kind of old you don't put your hand on. The first was tall, taller than the man in the expensive coat, with a clipped silver mustache and a face like the side of a cliff, weathered, lined, set hard. The second was shorter and heavier through the chest, with a scar that pulled at one eyebrow and gave him a permanent look of being about to ask you a difficult question. And the third walked with a cane, a polished black cane with a silver top. He had a limp, you could see it, the slight drag of one leg, but he kept perfect pace with the other two anyway, like he had spent 50 years flat out refusing to fall behind, and wasn't about to start now. They'd come for the remembrance, that was all. I learned later they came every year, the three of them, on this same quiet morning, not the big ceremony with the crowds and the cameras, but this smaller, private one. Lay a wreath, stand a while, remember, then go for a drink somewhere warm and not talk much. That's all this morning was meant to be. But now they were walking faster. Because they'd seen the crowd. They'd seen the disturbance. And then the tall one had seen something on the ground, something small and gray, and his whole stride had changed. The man in the expensive coat still hadn't noticed them. He was half turned away, mid-stride in his exit, still brushing rose petals off that immaculate sleeve, still wearing that little satisfied smirk. He saw the crowd looking past him, all those eyes going over his shoulder, and I swear this is true. He assumed they were finally looking at him with the respect he felt he was owed. He actually lifted his chin. He was so wrong. The three generals reached the edge of the path, and the tall one, the silver mustache, the cliff of a face, he stopped dead. He was staring at the old woman on the ground, and his whole face came apart. I have never in all my life watched a powerful man go soft that fast. 1 second he was a wall, pure command, the kind of presence that fills a space and pushes everyone to the edges. And the next second his eyes were huge and his mouth was open and every hard line in his face had dissolved, and he said one word, barely a word, more like a breath that happened to have a shape. A name. Enel. The old woman on the ground went still. She lifted her head, slowly, and she looked at him, and the whole crowd held its breath, all of us, the builder, the young woman with the pram, the chestnut seller who'd come out from behind his cart, all of us frozen and watching. And then the general, this towering man, chest full of medals, a man who had without question commanded thousands, a man the young guardsman had just turned to stone for, he dropped. He went down, on one knee, on the wet, freezing stone, in his full dress uniform in front of 100 strangers and all those phones. Right beside her. Nell, he said again, and this time his voice broke clean down the middle the way a dry branch breaks. Nell, it's you, my God, after all this time, it's you. The second general, the scar, the heavy chest, he was already moving, lowering himself down on her other side, one hand going gently to her back to steady her. And the third, the one with the cane, he couldn't kneel, you could see he couldn't, the leg wouldn't let him. So he planted that cane in front of him and gripped the silver top with both hands and bowed his head down over her. And I watched his shoulders begin to shake. This old, decorated soldier, standing in the rain, shaking. The man in the expensive coat had finally stopped walking. He'd finally understood that something was happening here that he did not control and could not buy his way out of. He turned back. His smirk was gone. Who, he started. His voice had gone thin and high. Who is she? Nobody answered him. Nobody so much as looked at him. For a man whose entire identity was "Do you know who I am?" I think being ignored in that moment might have been the worst thing that had ever happened to him. The tall general took the old woman's shaking hand in both of his huge ones, as gently as if he were holding a small bird. He looked at the blood at the corner of her lip. He looked at the red mark blooming on her cheek. And then he raised his eyes slowly to the man who'd done it. And I have never before or since seen rage like that on a human face. Not hot rage, not shouting, cold rage, still rage. The kind that is far, far more frightening than any amount of yelling, because you understand instantly that this is a man who has seen real things, done real things, and is right now choosing barely not to. This woman, he said, quiet, each word laid down like a stone. "Do you want to know who this woman is?" The square was so silent, I could hear the drizzle on the leaves. "This woman pulled me out of a burning vehicle when I was 23 years old." A sound went through the crowd, a sort of collective intake of breath. "We were hit," he went on, never raising his voice, never taking his eyes off the man. "Everything was on fire. I was trapped. I couldn't get out. And every man with any sense was running the other way because the whole thing was about to go up and they were right to run. And this woman," his voice caught and he steadied it, "this woman ran toward it. She crawled across open ground, under fire, and she reached into the fire, and she dragged me out by the back of my collar when every single person there had already written me off as dead." He paused. "And then," he said, "she went back." He turned his head, just slightly, toward the scarred general kneeling on the other side. "For him." And then toward the one with the cane. "And then she went back again, for him." The scarred general spoke for the first time. His voice was thick and wet and rough. "3 times," he said. "She went back into it 3 times. We told her to stop. We screamed at her to stop. She didn't stop." And then the general with the cane lifted his bowed head. And he spoke, and his voice was the oldest of the 3, low and cracked and rough as gravel dragged over gravel. "We are alive," he said, "because of her, the 3 of us, every one of us. I have a wife because of this woman, children. I have grandchildren, small ones, the youngest is 4, and not one of them would ever have drawn a single breath if this woman had decided on that day that we weren't worth the risk." He drew in air. "There are people walking the earth right now today who exist for one reason only, because she would not leave us to burn." And then slowly, he turned his old eyes on the man in the expensive coat, and he said, "And you struck her to the ground for walking too slowly with her flowers." The man's face had gone the color of the sky, gray, bloodless. He started to stammer. The big, confident voice was gone, and what was left was small and scrambling. I didn't look. I didn't know who she was. It was an accident. And the tall general rose to his feet. Slowly, deliberately, all the way up to his full, considerable height, until he stood looking down at this man, this loud, important, untouchable man who an hour ago had owned the whole square. And he said the thing that I think about more than anything else from that entire morning. The thing I've turned over in my head 1,000 times since. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly the problem. You didn't know who she was, so you decided she was nobody." He let it land. He let the silence carry it. "You decided she was nobody," he went on, "because she was old, because she was small, because her coat was worn and her flowers were cheap and she walked too slowly for your mourning. You looked at her and you decided she didn't matter, and so it didn't matter what you did to her." He took a step closer. The man stepped back. "She didn't do that, you understand. That day, in the fire, she didn't stop to check our ranks. She didn't ask whether we were important, whether we were worth it, whether there'd be anything in it for her. She saw 3 frightened boys who were about to burn to death, and she came. That is the whole difference between you and her, and it is the only difference that has ever mattered. She helped people when there was nothing in it for her but the chance of dying. And you hurt someone the very moment you thought there'd be no cost to you at all." By now there were 2 police officers moving in fast from the direction of the gate. Someone must have called, or they'd seen the crowd. And every phone in that square was up and filming. Every single one. The man who'd stood there an hour before and demanded, "Do you have any idea who I am?" was about to find out that, yes, very soon, the whole country would know exactly who he was. Just not at all in the way he'd meant it. But here's the part that stayed with me longest, and it isn't about him at all. By this point I'd more or less forgotten him. We all had. It's about her. Because the old woman, Nell, she was still down there on the cold stone. And while the general was speaking, she'd been watching the man's face. This man who'd hit her. And she did something I will never forget as long as I live. She reached up, and she found the tall general's hand, and she tugged it gently and she said, "Alistair, don't." Alistair, after all those years, 50 of them more, she remembered his name. Of course she did. "Don't waste this morning on him," she said. "He isn't worth 1 minute of it, and I haven't got so many mornings left that I can spare one." The tall General, Alistair, looked down at her, and the cold rage in his face cracked, and underneath it was just grief, just love, just an old man looking at the person who gave him his entire life. "Now help me up," she said. "Please, all of you. I came here to lay my flowers, and I'm going to lay them, and I don't want to be late. The boys are waiting." The boys. She still called them the boys. These 3 old generals with their canes and their gray hair and their grandchildren. In her mind, in the place where it counted, they were still those terrified 23-year-olds she dragged out of the fire one after another after another. They had grown into the most powerful men in the country, and to her they were, and always would be, her boys. So they helped her up, all 3 of them, and I have never seen anything handled so carefully in my life, like she was made of glass and gold and morning frost all at once. The one with the cane held her arm steady. Alistair kept his hand at her back, and the scarred general, the big heavy one with the difficult eyebrow, he went around gathering up every single one of her white roses off the wet pavement. Every one, even the bruised ones, even the one the man had dropped in her face. He picked them up one at a time with these enormous careful hands, and he wrapped them back up in their soft, damp brown paper as gently as if they were sleeping newborns. And then he straightened the paper, and then he gave them back to her and gave her a small nod, soldier to soldier. And the 4 of them walked together to the front of the memorial. The crowd parted, completely silent. People stepped back to make a path without anyone having to ask. Some of them were openly crying now. The young woman with the pram, the chestnut seller, the big builder in the high-vis was wiping his eyes with the back of a huge hand and pretending he wasn't. The boy in the school uniform was crying without any shame at all. And I'll be honest with you, so was I didn't even notice I'd started. And this tiny old woman in her worn gray coat, with her loose white hair and the bruise blooming on her cheek, flanked by 3 of the most decorated soldiers in the entire country, knelt down, with their hands steadying her every inch of the way at the foot of the memorial. And then she did something none of us expected. She didn't lay the flowers in the middle with the big formal wreaths. She wasn't there to be seen or honored or thanked. She'd never once been there for that. She turned slightly, and she reached up to the stone, to the long list of carved names, and she ran one trembling finger along them until she found the one she was looking for. Near the bottom, a single name. And she laid her cheap white roses directly beneath it. And she leaned in close to the cold stone, and she said, so softly that only those of us nearest could hear it, "Hello, my love, sorry I'm late." The tall general leaned down to the boy in the uniform who was closest and said very quietly, "Her husband. He was with us that day. He didn't get out. She saved the 3 of us." He paused. She couldn't save him. She saved 3 strangers' boys from the fire, and lost her own husband in the same one. And every year since every single year she had come back, quietly, alone, to lay white roses under his name and say sorry she was late. We found all of it out afterward in the days that came. That she lived alone across the city in a tiny flat. That she had almost nothing, a small pension, a careful budget, a kettle and a chair by the window. That to get here she took 2 buses and then walked the last half-mile in the cold, because the second bus didn't go all the way, and she did it on legs that were 80-some years old. That she had done this every November for decades and never told a soul, never asked for a thing, never once mentioned to anybody that she was the reason 3 generals were alive. Not one person in that square had ever known. Until that morning, when a man knocked her to the ground for the crime of walking too slowly with cheap flowers in her shaking hands. And 3 generals crossed a parade ground and knelt down in the rain. So, you want to know how it all ended? The man in the expensive coat was arrested right there in the square. The two officers took him by the arms and walked him away, and he went quietly, which surprised me, all that noise, all that do you know who I am, and in the end he just went gray and silent and small. And it was all over the news within a day. The videos, a dozen people's videos from a dozen angles, went absolutely everywhere. Millions of views, tens of millions, his name, his face, the company he ran. The same man who'd stood in a public square and demanded the world recognize his importance got his wish in the cruelest possible way. The whole country learned his name, and learned it attached to a clip of him knocking down an 80-year-old war hero and calling her flowers cheap. He lost the deal he'd been shouting about on the phone. He lost the company not long after. The thing he'd valued more than that old woman's dignity turned out to be the thing he had no real grip on at all. But honestly, I don't think about him much. He's a footnote, he always was. The story was never really about him. What I think about is her. In the weeks afterward, the papers dug up her whole story, and I read every word of it I could find. Her name was Eleanor. Everyone who'd ever loved her called her Nell. She'd been a field medic, a lifetime ago, in a war that most people my age have only half heard of and most people younger than me have never heard of at all. She enlisted at 19. She married a soldier, a quiet, kind man, by all the accounts I read. And she lost him before she was 30, in the same fire she'd pulled 3 strangers out of. And then she spent the next 50-odd years living quietly, asking for nothing, taking up as little room in the world as a person possibly can. The 3 generals did not let it go. They couldn't. When they found out how she'd been living, that she'd spent half a century on almost nothing, too proud to ever ask, while the 3 men whose lives she'd saved had gone on to have everything a life can hold. I'm told the tall one, Alistair, sat down in his kitchen and wept like a child. So they fixed it, quietly, the way they knew she'd want, because anything loud would have mortified her. They made sure she never took 2 cold buses in the dark again. There was always a car now, and a driver who came to think the world of her. They made sure her little flat was warm all winter, every winter. They made sure she wanted for nothing for whatever time she had left. And the one with the cane, the oldest of the 3, the one whose voice cracked like gravel, he started visiting her. Every single week. He'd sit in the chair by her window and they'd drink tea and not talk much, the way old soldiers do. Someone once asked him why he bothered, an important man like him, every week without fail. And he said, "She gave me 50 extra years of life. The least I can do is give her an afternoon of mine." She lived another 4 years after that cold November morning. 4 good years, the warmest of her whole long life, surrounded at last by people who knew exactly who she was. And every November, all 4 years, those same 3 old soldiers came to the memorial and laid white roses beside hers. Not as generals, not in their medals, not for the cameras. Just 3 old men in plain coats, standing in the cold beside the woman who'd carried them out of the fire. Just her boys. When she finally passed, peacefully in her sleep, I read they carried her. The 3 of them. 2 of them needed canes by then, and one of them could barely manage the weight, and they would not under any circumstances let anyone else take their place. They said they'd carried her name in their hearts for half a century. The least they could do was carry her the last little way themselves. So here's the thing I carry with me from all of it, and it's the thing I'd ask you to carry too, if you've stayed with me this long. That morning, a man looked at an old woman in a worn gray coat, with cheap flowers and shaking hands, and he decided she was nobody. And he could not possibly have been more wrong. Because the truth, the real truth, the one that whole morning was trying to teach us, is that you never, ever know who anybody really is. That tired old man asleep on the bus. That quiet woman shuffling slowly down the street with her shopping. That person you pass every single day and have somehow never once actually looked at. They are not nobody. There is no such thing as nobody. Every one of them has a whole entire life burning away behind their eyes. Fires they ran into, people they pulled out, people they couldn't, loves they lost, battles quiet and private and enormous that you will never know a single thing about. So be gentle, please. Be gentle with the slow ones, the small ones, the ones the world has decided are invisible, because the world is almost always wrong about who matters. One cold November morning, three of the most powerful men in the country knelt down in the freezing rain for a woman that everybody else had simply stepped over. And in the end, the only real difference between those three generals and the man who struck her down was that they bothered to look.